So hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today on the Kingscrowd Startup Investing Podcast. Today, we have a really interesting guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. His name is David Callaway. David is the founder and CEO of an organization called Callaway Climate Insights. Many of our users on the Kingscrowd website are really interested in investing in clean energy technologies, and we see all sorts of interesting companies raising in this space on the Kingscrowd platform. And so we wanted to bring in an expert in kind of the clean energy sector to chat with us and learn more about how to think about investing in the clean energy sector, and also just how to think about some of the major themes, things that are going on in this world today. So with that, David, I would love to have you, just mention a little bit about yourself and what you're up to at Callaway Climate Insights.
Sure, Chris. Well, I'm a lifelong journalist. I've worked for newspapers. I've worked for wire services. I worked at a startup 25 years ago called Bloomberg, which I think went on to do something. I worked at a startup called CBS MarketWatch in the digital financial news space. I was the editor-in-chief for many years. We raised money, went public, and sold that business to Dow Jones back in 2005. I was the editor-in-chief of USA Today for many years, and most recently, the CEO of The Street, which owns TheStreet.com, the business with Jim Cramer, and many people know. And we turned that business around and sold it a couple of years ago before the pandemic. So during the pandemic, I kind of wondered what I was going to do. I knew I wanted to write. I knew I wanted to be in the startup game. And I've always been fascinated by climate change, and not just the politics of it or even the science of it, but the stories behind the entrepreneurs, the small businesses, the startups, the big businesses that are starting to put a lot of money into the space. I started thinking about this, Chris, about 10 years ago, but then there wasn't a lot going on. There was a couple years of intensity around what was then called clean tech. And it was really the beginning of what today is the clean energy business. Lots of startups, but nothing really ended up happening. It fizzled out. We ran into the financial crisis, and that it died a little bit, or kind of went into hibernation. But it's come back with a vengeance in the last few years. The environmental, social, and governance space, the so-called ESG space, is the hottest space in the markets. And investors are plowing money into it. Banks and mutual fund companies are creating new products tied to it. And all of them are looking for that next great Amazon or Apple or Twitter or whatever of the ESG space. They're looking at electric vehicles, batteries, wind turbines, solar power, all sorts of different industries that are growing and rewarding entrepreneurs who are building startups in the space. At the same time, a lot of the more mature companies are getting in as well. So it's a great intersection of finance and technology and entrepreneurship with, of course, the most pressing problem of our time, maybe after COVID, right? But the most pressing problem long term. And so I think it's a fascinating space. We've been doing it for more than a year. We got thousands of people who have signed up, and going to continue growing it.
Very, very cool. And I kind of undersold you there on purpose because I wanted you to be able to introduce yourself. But David is definitely kind of a legend of the journalism world, and it's a real privilege to get to speak with you. So thanks for taking the time today. Obviously love what you're up to and think it's really, really interesting. And there's so many major themes in kind of the clean energy space that we're seeing play out right now. And you're absolutely right. It's both the big players and the small players that are kind of going after probably one of those markets where there's going to be multiple trillion-dollar companies created out of the needs that we have today. So the first one that I'd love to learn a little bit more about from you is, when it comes to EV vehicles, right? We just saw that GM is putting an incredible amount of capital towards EV vehicles. Can you talk a little bit about what you think is driving this market forward, where we're seeing it's not just going to be about Tesla anymore, it's going to be all of the major car manufacturers? And what does that mean for more of these upstarts like a Lordstown, et cetera?
Right. Well, it's interesting, Chris. Back about 20 years ago, when I was at MarketWatch, Microsoft owned the software business, and companies like Dell and Gateway and IBM owned the computer business, and Apple Apple had this tiny following. It was only about 3% of all computer users, but they were rabid followers. And now we've seen Apple develop, essentially build new businesses, not just around computers, but the mobile phone business, the music business, the streaming business, and it was just an incredible bet to make 20 years ago in a company with a small market share. Tesla started like that in EVs, right? Tesla wasn't the first company to do them, but they were the first company to make them sexy. And we've seen Tesla rewarded and Tesla shareholders rewarded sometimes against, what I would consider to be all odds, but the shares were kept going up over the years. But still, EVs are a very minuscule part of the auto market right now, roughly about 3%, even less in the US, a little bit more in Europe, 6%. So to see these companies, not just the General Motors, but the Volkswagens and the Fords, and some of the Japanese companies piling in Volvos, is Fiat's in Italy. You're seeing the folks who are running these companies saying this is the future. We're not going to miss out on it. We're certainly not going to cede it to Tesla. Part of that is also thanks to some of the startup companies that have sprouted up in the last few years, the Lordstown, Fisker, Nikola, all sorts of companies. And, there's been a lot of market enthusiasm about it, probably too much speculation. And these companies started to get ahead of themselves, as startups tend to do. Investors threw billions at them through special acquisition purpose vehicles, through SPACs. And we've seen these companies, particularly Nikola and Lordstown, get into trouble with the SEC and kind of with their business model. It seemed there was more smoke than fire, right? But they stirred something at the big automakers who are now coming in with a vengeance. And I still think there's a lot of room for the startups in the EV space, particularly in the battery space, which is going to be fueling all these EVs. A lot of the big companies are doing deals with startups on battery production and battery manufacturing plants. In the EV charging station space, right? There's no one that really owns that market right now. And the jury's out on whether it's going to be owned by the big gas station owners or the automakers or entirely new sets of energy companies. So lots of opportunity in this space, and yet it's still relatively small. So a lot of fund managers who are betting on it would think it could be 40 or 50% of the auto market in 10 years. Maybe that's a little enthusiastic, but it's certainly going to be growing a lot more than where it is now.
Really interesting. We've definitely seen several companies in the regulation crowdfunding space that have raised both for creating full vehicles, and we've also seen a lot of different battery technologies. One of the interesting ones that I saw recently, it was at an event where I saw Toyota has been working on some sort of hydrogen battery technology. Do you think we kind of had the answer to the battery yet, or are we still searching for that thing that's going to allow these cars to go more than 300 or 400 miles before you got to stop and wait 20 minutes, a half hour for your car to charge?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing, right? Nobody's going to buy those cars unless they can, be assured that they're going to be able to get to where they need to go and, in the time they need to go there. That's why I think the battery space is the most interesting space, and the one where technology companies, specifically young technology companies, are going to be able to make the most difference. The automakers know how to put together cars, but they're not so much, experts on the battery space. I don't think anybody has solved that, whether it's lithium ion or non-lithium ion or hydrogen fuel cells. Everybody's trying a different one, but there's no clear, front runner in this space. And I think the auto companies are trying to hedge their bets by partnering with a lot of them. But as a front runner or two emerge, it's going to be fascinating to watch.
That's really interesting. Another area that I'd love to hop into, and I could talk all day just about the EV stuff, is carbon capture technologies, carbon capture using timber. Obviously, a big story recently about JP Morgan purchasing a huge timber asset manager company. with the idea of getting into that game. About a year ago, we saw in the regulation crowdfunding space a company come called World Tree that was allowing people to invest in these large, timber farms that are going to help with carbon offsets. Can you talk a little bit about that, major trends we're seeing, why people are getting into it, the kind of economic opportunity you're seeing play out on that space?
Certainly. I think, Chris, it's become sort of accepted wisdom in the climate space that it's really not going to be enough to save the planet by simply stopping burning fossil fuels. We have to start taking carbon out of the atmosphere. We have to sort of pull in what we've already done, because what we've already done is probably already too much for the Earth to take. So one of the most interesting spaces really in the last 6 to 9 months has been the carbon storage business. And you're seeing interesting entrepreneurs who are pulling it out of air, who are pulling it out of the ocean. There's this group down in LA, I'm spacing on their name now, but they're actually pulling carbon out of sea particles, living sea particles, and creating things like fancy faux leather purses and silverware and stuff like that. And it's all going towards helping pull carbon from the sea and creating interesting products. A lot of the VCs I talk to are targeting carbon removal and carbon storage right now. And the carbon storage side really is the forest side. The trees suck in carbon. And so if you have a lot of forestry, you've got some interesting hedges against fossil fuel burning. But also there's a market developing, and you mentioned JP Morgan, for carbon offsets. Well, big polluters, gas companies, oil companies, can buy the offsets in a market. California has a strong market. Europe has a strong market. The UK just started their own market. China's developing a market. You can buy these carbon offsets at specific carbon prices, which are market focused and market based, and offset what your pollution. And so while that doesn't actually do a lot to take the pollution out of the atmosphere, it does make it more expensive for these companies to pollute because they have to buy the offsets. So what JP Morgan is doing, it buys this big forest investor, which owns, I think, 1.7 million acres of forestry around the world. And it can build offsets off of that, that it can sell. So it can play both sides of the market. So I think, we're going to see over the next 5 years, the carbon markets are going to become one of the new hot markets, more so maybe even than crypto, right? But you start to see it gain some sex appeal.
And what do you think investors who, I'm sure as we're kind of sitting here over the next year, 2 years, we will see several startups come and kind of playing in that carbon market space. What are things that investors should consider from a regulatory perspective and just in general as they approach thinking about investing in startups that are maybe trying to tackle carbon type issues?
Well, like any startup investor, you need to be careful that there's not more hype than substance, right? And the carbon offset market, like a lot of the ESG market in general, is very much more hype than substance these days. If I'm Exxon and I want to buy $1 million worth of offsets because I put $1 million worth of carbon into the air, does the offset in a forest in Oregon equal the offset in a forest in Indonesia? Different trees have different amounts of carbon they suck. So the markets are imperfect, which will allow for a lot of arbitrage and interesting plays going forward. But investors just need to be a little bit careful. The regulations on these things are nowhere near fixed. The metrics are nowhere near fixed. So it's a little bit of a gut feeling and a little bit of an extra risk. But that's why a lot of investors are in startups anyway.
Right, absolutely. So I'd like to kind of do a half jump back and a half talk on another topic. So one of the other things that a lot of people talk about when it comes to EV vehicles, right? These electric vehicles as well. If the source of power for those vehicles isn't clean, then just because the gas isn't or the fumes aren't coming out the back of the car, it doesn't mean that it's not being done somewhere else that I can't visually see, right? So is it really better? And one of those major new power sources that is renewable is wind energy. And we're finally seeing for the first time in the United States, we're building wind farms offshore. We're building wind farms on land and really investing in that space. We're seeing GEs come out with like the largest windmills or whatever you want to call them in the world. Really interested to hear your thoughts on this space. Where is kind of wind energy in the United States going from here? Yeah, we'd love to get your thoughts on that.
So to begin with, on the first part of your question, the flip side of the electric vehicle boom is that it is carbon intensive, right? Tesla emits a lot of carbon. The electricity that these companies use is generated, a lot from carbon. The batteries are using chemicals and minerals that are generated, by carbon intensive mining activities, fracking, stuff like that. So you need to watch out for that. There's no pure EV play where there's no carbon involved, at least so far. We'll see how that develops. But in terms of the electric grid and where these EVs are pulling the electricity from, that is getting more renewable by the year, by the month almost. And a lot of that is solar, and a lot of it, as you pointed out, is wind. And in the wind space, the US has been, for the most part, way behind Europe in that wind space. Europe has taken advantage of it, the North Sea wind, to create offshore wind farms, onshore wind farms. And they've got big companies like Ørsted in Scandinavia and in Denmark, I think it is, and Iberdrola in Spain. They're investing big time in wind systems. And the US was kind of caught for many years and still to some extent is caught in the kind of, where do we put this stuff? Local fishermen don't want it in there, outside of Boston or in the Gulf of Mexico, California, it's unattractive. And then we went through the Trump years, right? And nothing happened. Now the Biden years are starting to approve these projects. A big one just got approved off of Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. There's another big one off of Rhode Island. New York and New Jersey are announcing plans for their own. Even California is looking down off the LA coast, Gulf of Mexico. And so these offshore wind, and they're using, a lot of it is coming from help from the European powerhouses or developing the systems. You did mention GM's got these wild wind turbines, and it's in the game too. It really is, not GM, GE. It's in the game too. But the opportunity for the startups there is really in kind of AI and metric measurement, right? The wind and solar and wind power to some extent is dependent upon the weather and the sun, right? And the wind doesn't blow consistently 24 hours a day. So what do you do when it's down? What do you do when it's up? And people who own these wind turbines, big companies, and the investors who own them need better ways to measure how much power they're getting and when they can ramp up, when they should ramp down. So there's a lot of interesting startups in that space. And I think, really the whole explosion of AI is gonna revolutionize the renewable energy space, because you're gonna be able to create algorithms and functions that folks in early renewable procedures just weren't able to do. So, if I'm a startup, if I'm an investor looking for startups in wind, that's where I'm looking.
Very, very interesting. Well, we've talked about some major themes here: carbon capture, EVs, clean energy production with wind. Is there any other major themes, again, as we think about investors considering looking for startups and things of that nature, are there any other mega themes in the clean energy space that you think are worth mentioning?
Well, in the clean energy space, you could look at geothermal, right? Nuclear is in the mix, and that's something that really hasn't gained a lot of investment in the U.S. For a long time, but is starting to come back in some circles. But just in the climate change world, the climate finance world, cleaning up the ocean is generating a ton of startups. So-called ocean tech is huge. Fashion, almost the most wasteful industry in the world, maybe more wasteful than food systems, right? Is generating tons of really cool startups that are using different ways to save energy and save money in the fashion world, in the development and usage and waste of products. Agriculture, obviously. So there's lots of there's room for everybody in this space, Chris, and I think we're going to start to the smart investor needs to monitor all of it, and really kind of watch for the angles of who's going to start to sprout out.
No, absolutely. Well, as we're getting wrapped up here, one thing I would like to mention to investors listening in, as of June 23rd, when we're taping this, we have a few companies that will be raising for at least a couple months longer. If you're interested in getting into the clean energy space, that look interesting based on some Kingscrowd data. The first company I'll mention is LPPFUSION, which is on Wefunder and is creating a green fusion energy generation product worth checking out. Really interesting technology there. There's another company called Flower Turbines, going to our wind energy conversation. They are located on Start Engine. They've done multiple raises online and are building innovative small wind turbines. It's a really cool technology and they're getting some very nice traction as well. And lastly, an earlier stage technology that's still in development, but building something really cool in the fuel space, Manta Biofuel, located on Republic. They're reinventing crude oil renewably, this time with algae-based fuels. Definitely something that's pretty neat, very interesting science, worth checking out and learning more about. But before we head out today, David, I'd love to hop back to you and say, for anyone who wants to get more insights, I know I subscribe to your newsletter. I find it really useful in terms of strategically thinking about the clean energy space. For those who want to join Callaway Climate Insights, what can they do in order to better inform themselves on this space?
Well, you can start by going to CallawayClimateInsights.com. That's CALLAWAY. You can subscribe for free, see if you like it. We publish 4 days a week. And if you like it, we have a premium level, which is for now is only $5 a month. We've got a special going on, 4th of July special. So if you go right away, it's that you can get in at a good price. We look forward to seeing you. Most of our readers are asset managers, sustainability executives, startup entrepreneurs, media types like myself, and small business aficionados like you, Chris.
Outstanding. Well, thank you so much, David. It's been a really informative conversation. And for those who want to learn more about those organizations we mentioned today on the call, you can go to kingscrowd.com to check them out. Thank you all for tuning in and have a wonderful day. Take care now.